I think there is a sense in the Middle East, in Israel, including among some of his members of his government, not the most extreme, but enough is enough. There's lots of issues and problems with Israel with continuing this war, quite apart from the international condemnation, the issues around army reservists not turning up, social tensions, all of those other issues, economic damage.
So, look, Donald Trump is going to meet with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu later. The US president is, of course, keen to bring about peace in Gaza, as he keeps telling us. But given the fact that 2 previous ceasefire deals have collapsed, securing an end to this conflict will, of course, not be easy. Mark, you've been writing in the Sunday Times about how difficult it is to eliminate Hamas and why Israel may have to live with the fact that the group continues to exist. How does it continue to exist? They've been at war for 2 years. They've killed so many people. They seem to have managed to sort of decapitate the Iranian regime in the space of a day. How have they not managed to destroy Hamas?
Well, I remember quite early on in this whole business, terrible business of this war, Mark Regev, of all people, who briefly came back as a Israeli government spokesman, saying in an interview, you can't kill an idea. And although some on the Israeli right would have castigated him or put it very differently, I think there has always been that understanding, particularly in the Israeli military, the ones who are supposed to come up with some sort of military solution to this security issue. And so they've always understood that. So the question now that they have to ask themselves, if Hamas enters seriously into this discussion, which we don't know, there have been quite a few false starts, not just the 2 ceasefires that have actually happened, but all sorts of other false starts. If Hamas enter into it, then the question the Israeli military, the Israeli political establishment have to ask themselves is, and indeed answer, how much Hamas can we live with? Now that sounds a bit strange, but what they've done was they've sort of destroyed the military organisation of Hamas a couple of times over in the initial very intense campaign that took place between October 2023 and about May 2024, in which the great majority of civilians who've died in Gaza also died during that period. And the Israeli military at that point more or less said, well, we're done. Mm-hmm. But Netanyahu couldn't, for lots of reasons, political and other, bring himself to make a deal at that point. So that's the question they're still asking themselves. Now, obviously, since then, a lot more pressure has been put, particularly since the collapse of the ceasefire that came in January and it finished in March, which the Israelis effectively ended that. They've got to ask themselves, and talking to people in Israel from the security establishment, you get all sorts of curious formulations, like, well, we understand that they have to continue as a political party. Well, turn it around and look at it from the Hamas perspective. Okay, well, if we're going to carry on in business as a political party with sort of cadres and a sort of grassroots organisation across that territory, what if some of these guys are still carrying guns?
Sure.
What if, do we not still at that point retain the ability to maintain our power? Or as other Palestinians who are opposed to Hamas would say, to coerce and threaten other Palestinians who have always objected to what Hamas has done.
How much credence would you give the theory that the sort of fairly widespread theory that before the October the 7th attacks, there was at least a powerful strain of thought in Israel that said that quite wanted Hamas in power in Gaza because it was better to have an unreasonable Palestinian group in authority than a reasonable one. That it did Israel's objectives good to have this this unstable group next door that couldn't be negotiated with, that wasn't rational, that were always the villain.
Well, I think that's been a view of some on the Israeli right, and even when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, took its army out in 2005, and indeed demolished 20 settlements there, took the whole Jewish population out, which many people would say, well, that's a great start in a way for a peace process because you're delivering a big slab of the Palestinian state of the future in one fell swoop. Well, of course, it didn't turn out that way. But some people were saying even then, oh no, Sharon's done this because he knows Hamas will take over, and I think a bit too Machiavellian, but of course that's what did happen. They took over the following year, and then they started murdering a lot of people who supported the other Palestinian factions and consolidated their power through coercion. So, yeah, since then, effectively, since 2007, it's been very hard to see there being a sort of unified partner for peace. And yeah, I think some Israeli politicians have exploited that quite cynically. And in the year or months leading up to the October the 7th attack, there was a lot of commentary that Netanyahu was enabling Qatar to send money to Hamas. I think there was a sort of mistaken belief that if Hamas got used to a relatively more comfortable life, a relatively more corrupt life, making money on all the construction and other projects going on in there, that they would be quiescent and that in some sense they would moderate their long-term aims as a militant Palestinian organisation. Yeah. But of course that was a miscalculation.
Well, so we hear now that Hamas says it's ready to discuss a ceasefire. To what extent do we know who Hamas is now? Because with the senior leadership having been in our understanding destroyed, who are we talking about? Are we talking about people who've risen to power over the last few months? Are we talking about leaders in exile? I mean, like, who is there to negotiate?
Well, there is a guy, Al-Din al-Haddad, who he's one of the few surviving members of the Hamas ruling council that launched the October the 7th attacks. It's reckoned that I've seen different counts that there were 16 people on the council or 18. But there's only reckoned to be 3 or 4 of them still alive. There's one political leader still in Gaza, and there's Haddad. Now, he is definitely a military figure. He definitely literally stepped into dead men's shoes, the command of the Gaza Brigade in 2021 before this started, but through a different Israeli attack. Then the command of the whole of Gaza the months after the October the 7th massacres. And following the killing by Israeli bomb in May of this year, he stepped into the shoes of Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of Yahya Sinwar, but Mohammed Sinwar at that point in command of Gaza in command of Hamas throughout Gaza. So that's how he's come to power. He's also come to power as a guy whose power base was in Gaza City and that area, reckoned by the Israelis to be the most militant elements of Hamas, and also reckoned by the Israelis at various times to be the area where most of their hostages are held. And in the end, I think Haddad's grip on power at the moment comes down largely to the fact that he is still in control of those surviving hostages. It's become that crude that the Hamas organisation and structure of brigades and battalions and all of that has in many parts of Gaza been destroyed. The organisation has regenerated a bit at the grassroots level, lots of volunteers, not that much know-how, not that many weapons anymore. But Haddad remains in charge because he controls their key bargaining chip. And I think when we look at this in the next few days going forward, I think the key things to listen for are not Hamas has agreed to, a peace deal or whatever. Of course, they've wanted a long-term peace deal for quite a while now. It's whether Hamas effectively agrees that they're going to surrender power. That's the key Israeli war aim, and the hostages, of course, the last hostages. From the Israeli perspective, the key thing to listen for is, can they, as part of a long-term agreement, accept that Hamas will continue to function as a political party in the Gaza Strip?
So with Netanyahu and Trump meeting then, to come down to it, and they're going to be meeting kind of imminently. What I guess the first question is how likely you think it is that Trump begins to lose patience with Netanyahu, begins to think Netanyahu isn't as on board for a peace deal as he thinks he is.
Well, Trump, we've had the kind of Truth Social posts, and we've had him saying, I'm going to be very firm with Netanyahu, but then again, he said things about Putin getting on the wrong side of him and stalling for time and all these other things he said when he's occasionally felt the need to sound a condemnatory note about Putin and his actions in Ukraine. So with regard to Netanyahu, I think it's a bit different because in Trump's worldview, he and Netanyahu, they may not like one another that much personally, but as we know, everything with Trump is transactional and business-based, and they've just done some really important business, which is taking on Iran and taking Iran down a peg. So I think clearly Trump is in a better humour with Netanyahu than he is with Putin. But still, he's still not putting solid pressure on Putin. So I think that gives us some sense that probably Trump is not going to put that much pressure on Netanyahu. But I think there is a sense in the Middle East, in Israel, including among some of his members of his government, not the most extreme, but enough is enough. There's lots of issues and problems with Israel with continuing this war, quite apart from the international condemnation. The issues around army reservists not turning up, social tensions, all of those other issues, economic damage. So I think it's possible that Trump will lead Netanyahu to a place where he's ready to do this sincerely. But even if they get the ceasefire, we know that twice before the ceasefire has started, and Netanyahu has always used that formula of being able to return to military action if further phases. And that, of course, conversely, is what Hamas is very much on the lookout for and will be trying to get some sort of guarantee that this goes beyond a sort of phase one.
So, I mean, would it be correct to say that Hamas is basically in the place that Donald Trump wants them to be to negotiate a ceasefire, or is he going to be relying on pressure from other actors in the Middle East, Qatar and so on?
I think the latter. Qatar is very important to Hamas for lots of reasons. The other mediators, Egypt, really dislike Hamas for their own reasons. But between these different mediators, there will be a lot of pressure. And in the end, the question for Haddad now in charge of Hamas is really that, is he going to take a deep breath and a leap of faith in doing something which appears to be effectively winding up the military organisation of Hamas while surrendering this key bargaining chip, the last hostages. And he will try and bridge the gap between those two things by insisting, presumably to his subordinates and cadres, that no, we're going to carry on. We'll just do it much more subtly, and we'll go underground and stuff like that. But that it's if we start to hear noises about Hamas being willing to surrender up the last of the hostages, living and dead, then we'll know that perhaps we are getting close to the point where he will make that really difficult decision.
Finally, Mark, while I've got you, in other matters diplomatic, the French President Emmanuel Macron is in the UK for a state visit this week. What's going to be top of the agenda for Macron and Starmer? Is it all about Ukraine still?
No. Well, I think the boats and the crossings of the Channel are very critical. There will undoubtedly be conversation about Ukraine. I think, though, the truth is that having a few months back tried to spearhead this attempt to raise this reassurance force in the event of a peace deal in Ukraine, that the French and British know that isn't worth that much effort at the moment, because we don't seem to be anywhere near a ceasefire or peace deal in Ukraine. So, the focus will be on the boats and a French willingness to do certain things, like to get their feet wet, which was a bit of a...
Well, we saw the pictures this weekend of them in the sea slashing the boats.
Yes, well, they had been slashing the boats on land. So then the smugglers moved to this different model where they cruise up and down the coast, and the French police had not been able to literally wade in and do it.
Health and safety.
Well, they've now changed. That's changed, as has the negotiation on this deal, whereby the UK could send a certain amount back to France, but as long as it took an equal amount of people with a legitimate asylum claim. So that would involve some measure of assessment by the UK on the French side, which certainly the last government was always reluctant to do.
How much do the French care about this side of the equation? How much?
That's really good.
I mean, how much pressure is Macron under from people going, no, you have to let them leave? I mean, does the French public care about this at all?
That's a really good question, which in a way I struggle to answer. All I can tell you from the little reporting and time I've spent on that time is it's a big issue there in the Pas-de-Calais and those parts. And of course, he's from not that far away from there, and so, but I don't think it's a huge national issue, and I think in France there's a good deal of schadenfreude actually at Britain and the fruits of Brexit and all that kind of stuff. But I think it is a deeply vexed issue if you live up there on the coast, and people don't like having all these guys hanging around waiting for boats or trucks to jump on and all the rest of it. And it has been an irritant in French regional politics for many years, no doubt about it.